Denes Boros, and this is Insane in the Endgame. So today I'm going to take a look at a couple of recent games from the Euro Rapid tournament featuring Magnus Carlsen, Nakamura, and all the big elite players. Now, Dubov has been really showing off his skills and actually managed to qualify to the playoffs. And it actually has to do with a couple of games that has been played in the preliminaries. So I am going to focus just a little bit on the games played. Just a second here. So this game that I want to start with first is Shankland and Dubov, which actually been very interesting from the opening. D4, D5, C4, E5. And in fact, this is very surprising because it is very, very rare to see the Albin counter-gambit ever show up on the highest of levels. And what makes this extremely special, the D takes E5 instead of D4, Dubov plays my move, Knight E7, which I actually played a couple times online already, which in the databases. Knight E7 is actually an interesting idea, trying to keep the tension. And this kind of put Shankland in a difficult position where he had to defend a position which is very unfamiliar to him, and it is sort of a new concept, not very well known at all. There has been only a handful of games. Knight F3, Knight C6, Knight D2, D takes C4, E3, Knight G6, playing typical Albin style, but we are not going to focus too much on the middle game, but on the endgame part. Queen A4, trying to press, Bishop D7, E6 takes, Bishop takes, Bishop E7, castle, castle, Queen B5, Rook B8, Knight E4, Queen D7, Bishop D2, Knight CE5. And we can state that at this moment, the position is roughly even. Nobody really has better chances. Both black and white are well developed. However, there are some little details that you have to notice, and that is that there is some asymmetrical play on both sides. White has an advantage of 4 versus 3, while black has the advantage of 3 versus 2 on the queen side. Queen takes D7, Knight takes D7, Rook C1. And this is actually critical moment number 1. What are you going to do? Are you just going to be very passive but solid as black, or be more ambitious? But whenever you kind of look at a Dubov game, you know the answer. It never is solid and passive. So he goes for C5. And C5 is sort of signaling to Shankland that he is clearly aiming to mobilize those pawns and roll it down with B5 and C4. Now, it won't be an easy task. White, of course, has B3, and some of those pieces for black are a little bit loose. Not as much on E7, but the knight on D7 is actually a little bit undefended. Rook FD1, Rook FD8. Therefore, Dubov over-defends it and then prepares the idea. Bishop C3. And again, we get into these typical positions where B5, of course, is going to be an idea, but here Dubov realizes that, okay, these pieces are not too well placed, but you can't really improve them right now. Shankland's pieces kind of takes away all the best squares, so he goes on to activate some other pieces. And here he goes for this maneuver of Knight F8, Knight E6. And because of the closed nature of the position, which I could really call semi-closed, Dubov has the time to activate that knight. Knight F8, King F1, Knight E6. Over defending, almost triple defending the C5 pawn. And you can already visibly see that black is doing much better than a couple of moves before. This knight is actually participating in the action. b3. Now this bishop looks annoying, so Dubov goes f6, just reducing the scope of that bishop. King e2, king f7, g4. Now, Shankland has been surprised in the opening, but he's still doing a good job playing the white side of this endgame. He's maybe not better, but he is trying to fix Dubov's structure, and he's not letting him go f5 and g6, putting all those pawns on white squares, which is typical in these type of endgames. If you have a dark squared bishop, you should post and put your pawns on the other color, that is, white squares. But Shankland does not allow that. In fact, make sure that Dubov's pieces stand passive. Knight b6, aiming to get this knight to d5. Chase the bishop away and also kind of centralizing the knight. Bishop a5. And bishop a5 in some ways does feel a little bit reactionary. Not necessarily a bad move, but it doesn't really have a constructive idea behind it, apart from sort of trying to hinder Dubov's plan. Something like knight d2, knight c4 might be a little bit better instead of bishop a5, as bishop a5 is a little bit putting bishop on the sides. Bishop a5, rook takes d1, rook takes d1. Although Dubov's next move is somewhat surprising, and if you're used to principled chess, this move might catch you unawares, and probably did catch Sam Shankland unawares here as well. So I'm going to leave you guys a little bit of time to figure out what move Dubov played here. You would think that black would play something like rook c8, takes a4, and then Shankland would be correct. There are just too many white square weaknesses. This bishop is pretty bad, and an eventual knight d2, knight c4 might lead to a big advantage for white. However, this is by no means forced for black, and he does the most unconventional move you can possibly find here, and that is knight a8. This is not something the doctor ever prescribes you to do. You shouldn't put your knight on the rim and on a8. However, after h4 and b6, this knight will make a slight return to the game, and white really doesn't have any ways of punishing that. Note, rook d7 would be countered by king e8, smoking out that rook. If you go back, just b6, knight c7. And the rook d2, king e8 inclusion doesn't make any big differences here. So h4, b6, bishop c3, rook d8. So now with the pawn already moved to b6, for example, rook c8, rook d7 could be annoying. So Dubov circumvents that with rook d8. Rook takes d8, knight takes d8, g5. And g5 is an ambitious move, which by in itself is not a bad thing, being ambitious, but g5 does create some weaknesses on h4. If, for example, white goes something like h5, there is still a very good blockade and sort of taking away those important squares on g6 and f5. So white probably isn't worse at all. g5 is ambitious though. Shankland is trying to press on the f-pawn and create a juicy outpost on f5. Knight e6, g takes, knight g3. So white is pushing here and tries to kind of claim stake on f5 and pushing black back, but this does give ample chances for Dubov to win. And as you will see, it does happen. So again, with every position like this, you have to figure out which piece of yours is completely out of play. And I mean, it is fairly obvious. It's knight on a8, so it's coming back into the game with knight c7. Knight f5, knight d5. So clearly, here, Dubov isn't crying bitter tears for that bishop. He is much too happy to give it away. And in that case, he would have two amazing knights versus a somewhat blocked bishop, which is sort of staring at the wall of that pawn on f6, which is very hard to remove. And then black does have this easy plan of b5 and c4. And that probably is just much more comfortable for black. Winning, I'm not sure, but easier to play with black, that is out of question. That is, of course, the case. Bishop d2, of course, retaining the bishop, not taking this one. And these are those ridiculously underestimated moves. Bishop f8. I've seen this one, and I think if you've seen my previous Insane in the Endgame, you've seen the Reti game, where Reti played bishop d8, bishop b6, activating a bishop that was supposed to be quite bad. This move by Dubov sort of resonates in that same direction. He moves that bishop away and says, yes, this might not worth a lot, but this bishop might prove useful later in the game, supporting the c5 pawn or after the eventual b5, c4 break. So a4, a6, rolling it up, bringing those pawns into the game, creating a passer. And with every endgame, one of the most important things is to create a pass pawn. King d3, b5. A takes. Now still, if you'd ask me, is there a guarantee anyone's going to lose this game? I wouldn't say so. The game is still roughly even, but with black having more and more chances with having 2 versus 1 on the queen side, while white really didn't have a chance to create a pass pawn of his own. Bishop a5. This bishop keeps returning to a5, sort of taking away and restricting black's pieces, but it still just doesn't strike as the most accurate. Knight g7, takes h5, a nice little move, kind of getting closer to the all-powerful h8 square, and also sort of fixing the pawn on h7. King e6, bishop d2, bishop h6. Again, notice that Dubov does everything in his power to activate his bishop. Knight h4, bishop g5, knight g2, f5. And you can already see that this is a great success. This is a great success for black, because this bishop that was sort of cut off now actually is dominating that knight on g2. It's dominating that knight, and now it is clear that it is black who has the better chances. f4, bishop e7, and now knight f6, knight e4 does look quite threatening, and that pawn that looked quite nice on h5 actually becomes a target. So because of Shankland's hesitant play, now Dubov has clear winning chances in this position. e4, takes, knight f6, here, knight takes h5. But there is another thing that we've got to talk about, and that is the reduced material. So if Sam Shankland manages to exchange off those pawns off the board and keep a piece, he will probably have a theoretical draw. However, those pawns are on the 2 sides of the board, which usually favors the one with those 2 pawns, and it is actually not that easy to defend, because white has to be very accurate when to and how to sacrifice. Knight e3, knight f6. So first thing first, Dubov makes sure that all of his pawns are defended, and then he looks for plans. He's not rushing any pawn moves till that. f5, king d6, going over to help out those C and B pawns. Bishop E1, knight D5, bishop G3, king C6. King is moving over. C4 actually is becoming a big threat. Of course, it doesn't make any sense for Shankland to exchange because of the aforementioned two pawns rolling on the H file and C file. So naturally goes knight G4, bishop D6. So we're just going to see a couple of moves where Shankland avoids exchanges and Dubov offers it again and again. Bishop H4, and now as these guys and pieces got a little bit discoordinated, he goes H5. You can only attack it with knight F6, but that would lead to further simplifications, and with the king being awfully close to F7, that doesn't look too threatening for black. Knight F2, bishop E5. Again, notice how much Dubov centralizes his pieces. Knight E4, knight B6, F6, knight D7. Still, that square is under control, so even though this looks visually appealing, it does not amount to a whole lot. F7, king D5, bringing the king, bishop G3, bishop G7. Dubov is being extremely careful, and he is very cognizant of the fact that this game is very important. He needs to win this in order to have a chance to qualify. Knight D6, king C6, over defending, king E4, H4. Little tactical tricks you can't take because king takes D6, and now you actually can see that white hinges on a little bit. Like if the F pawn is lost, it's game over. Bishop H2, bishop F8, just chasing the knight away, H3. Now you can't really win the H pawn without reorganizing your pieces, but it might take just too much time. Bishop G3, B4. Therefore, Dubov sort of prepares for the advance on the other side. So when Shankland takes the pawn, he already has a passer going on the C or B file. King F3, king D5, king G4, check. Again, every exchange is in favor of black. King takes, knight takes F7, check, king D4. And the other thing that I didn't actually mention, as white took time to take that pawn with the king, there's a king missing on this side. So virtually, black is up a king plus a pawn on this side of the board. Knight C4, king C3, knight A5, bishop D6. And with this king being so far away, again, this is just completely winning. If you take, here, black can just go knight B5, knight D4, and knight takes B3, and it's just completely winning, or the simple C4. Both cases, it is just easily winning for black. Bishop F2, knight E5, king C2, bishop C7, C4. And even though the material is reduced, you just really don't have enough time to stop the B pawn from promoting. So quite a spectacular game by Dubov. Even though the middle game slash endgame was roughly even, he did take his little moments and chances to outplay Shankland, which was actually very important for him to qualify for the playoffs where he got in. So this was the Shankland game I wanted to show, and I do want to show the other game he played against Dominguez. So this game against Dominguez, again, this is a must-win scenario, so he plays another funky opening. Not quite the gambit that I came up with knight e7, but a bit more of an adventurous version of the dragon. d6, this is the Rauzer, and everybody and their friends play e6 here. But Dubov is known to be very inventive, and he goes up with the idea of g6. He's saying, I am willing to ruin my structure. You might take there. I might get a weakness or two on f6 and d6, but for an exchange, I will get the bishop pair. That should provide me enough play. And this, of course, leads to very uncompromising play, and which will eventually lead to an endgame. Bishop b5, queen d2. They're playing all the casual moves. Takes, takes, knight b3, bishop e6. So black is actually not that worried to lose a pawn. Dubov sort of claims the bishop pair will compensate for that, and that in the long run, that will be enough, as these knights are a little bit clumsy on c3 and b3. So queen takes d6 was played by Dominguez, queen b6, queen c5, f5. So this is actually the idea of Dubov's concept. He is willing to give and part with a few and a couple of pawns for activity. Queen takes, ab, ef, bishop f5, knight d4. And this is again a critical point. How does black react to these threats? Does he take? Does he do something else? But if you just ask Dubov, you know he is going to keep those bishops, because that's the heart and soul. If he loses the bishop pair, he's just probably going to be down a pawn for not much. Bishop d7, a3, rook e8. And this is kind of modern chess that some might not be used to seeing. Black is not unhappy with being down a pawn, but with the bishop pair. Now, if you're a big expert on openings, you might notice similarities between this and the Marshall endgames, where again you have two bishops, but down a pawn. And usually it is a decent endgame for the black player. It does seem like the same thing here. Black has ample compensation, not at all winning, of course, but there is an imbalance going on. So if both sides are ambitious, anything can happen, as it did in this game. Rook d3. And talking about imbalances, it's one thing to have bishop versus two knights with an extra pawn, but you still have to find the right moves and ideas. And the first question I'm sort of asking is which side we should be playing. Naturally, we don't tend to want to play on the queen side because we have only 2 pawns versus 3, and it's just not what we would be looking for. And in fact, that's not what Duda, that is not what Dubov does here. He actually plays h5. He says, okay, it might not be apparent just yet what I'm doing with h5, but you'll see once I get to push my pawn down the board, that might actually become an asset. Rook d1, rook c8. Over defending that pawn, so this bishop can freely move once this knight moves on from d4. f3, c5. c5, chasing that knight away and sort of preparing this bishop f5 idea once the knight jumps. Knight b5. Actually, he doesn't do so, probably because he didn't like these knight d6 ideas. So he takes her, takes here, check, here, and rook e2. And now we get these typical unbalanced endgames. Black has a very active rook and a bishop very well placed on h6, stopping any rook d2 ideas, and might help out if push comes to shove and if there's a b pawn rolling down the board. And now you can see the point of h5. This pawn will be useful in the ending, and I would definitely say this might just prove very much crucial at the late count. Rook g1, just defending the pawn. bishop e3, rook h1. These are not awe-inspiring moves by Dominguez, but probably he was not feeling too confident with his chances if he gives up the g2 pawn. Rook e8, knight d6, rook e6, knight e4. Just trying to bring the knight back and sort of smoke out that rook. Still, you can take on g2, you would lose your bishop on e3. f5. Again, typical Dubov move. He goes forward. Whatever happens, happens. It, of course, is justified. He wants to win the g2 pawn, but it comes at a price of weakening that structure. Knight c3, rook g2, rook e1, f4. And look how the situation has changed. From a very organized Dominguez with play on the d file and knight on b5, black actually was sort of pushed back. In that case, now it's a role reversal. This rook on g2 is strong, plenty of weaknesses on f3 and h2, and this h-pawn is roaming down and might be the one queening on this square. So knight d5, king f7, bringing in the king. Knight takes e3, f takes, rook takes, takes, rook takes h2. And for the initiated, you'd feel that this is nothing special. But Dubov has the pawn already on h5, while white really doesn't have a single pawn on the fourth. And it's also ready to be pushed to the fourth and third. Very close, only 2 moves away from queening. And there is also a big difference between this king and this king stuck on b1. That king is really not participating. And with the difference between the rook's kings, this is a very advantageous endgame for Dubov. And now you can kind of tell that these little differences between these elite players show. It shows that Dubov just has a better foresight, or at least he had a better foresight. In the preliminaries, he sort of anticipated that if events kind of die down and they get an endgame, he will get better chances. Now, in the previous example between Shankland and Dubov, it was a to and fro battle, but in this case, you can see that Dominguez couldn't quite clarify the position, because with every exchange, his position just got worse. b4, takes, a takes, rook f2. Fixing this rook on e3, it can never move again, because you lose the f-pawn, and the h-pawn will make a run for it. Now, the biggest problem for Dominguez is that after c4, black can go h4, and the aforementioned problem of that king being on this square, on b1, just shows. Because after pawn push, takes, h3, h2 threatens with promotion with mate. So that is a big threat, and it's very uncomfortable to meet with white. So he goes king b2, trying to avoid that. h4, b5, h3. And now you can see that that earlier move of h5 actually comes into play. The pawn is only 2 moves away from actually promoting, while white is nowhere near close to promoting himself. f4, h2. 1 move away, and white is still way behind. Rook h3, king f6, rook h4. So Dominguez is sort of trying to build a blockade, but he is just not in time. He tries to sort of stop black from getting and coming forward, because if you go king f5, rook takes f4, there's rook takes h2. But in rook endgames, it's not really the quantity of the pawns that matter, but the quality of it all. So he goes g5 and says, if I could just get my king to g2, I am going to win this game cleanly. Rook h6, king f5, takes. Again, note, you do not have time to take that pawn because I just queen. Rook h7, king g4. And here you can see the unfortunate placement of this king kind of kills all counterplay that Dominguez would have. If you go here, there's this typical operation of rook f3 check, rook h3, and the promotion is incoming. There's just nothing you can do about it. So there's just no way to go forward with the king and the pawn, and Dominguez is just relegated to move this rook around, but that's not going to save the game. Rook h6, king g3, check, king f3, check, king g2, and now we get into the bridge building part of the game. Check here, rook h6, king g1, and Dominguez resigned because there's absolutely no counterplay anymore. There's promotion coming, and even if you start hoping to move forward, here black can just cut you off with this rook f5 move. There's no way forward. The king will just bolt into the center, and it's just game over. It's a very clean win by Dubov. Not at all easy to win a game like this, especially at this high level. But it was kind of inspiring to see that he sort of built it all up for the endgame and was even willing to take some risks to get into this situation. Talking about risks, the third game I'm going to show you is between So and Duda. So in this match situation, Duda was leading in their match, so Wesley had to win. So now we're going to see how a super grandmaster tries to win a slightly better endgame that looks minuscule, but then see, he still manages to win. So let's start from the opening. Wesley was playing white and Duda was black. b3, bishop b2, c5 takes, and he takes d5. Quite a brave choice by Duda, but he's kind of claiming that, yes, I will have an isolated pawn on d5, but is a weakness I can tolerate, and it won't be enough for you to win. And that'll be sort of the debate between Wesley and Jan-Krzysztof Duda, whether that's just slightly better for white or actually is winnable for Wesley. d4, of course, you've got to isolate the d5 pawn. Bishop e2, d takes c5, and we get this famous structure. And actually, it does seem to me it's kind of 50-50. Sometimes the defenders do defend successfully, and in fact, Duda was very close to be successful. On other times, the attacker just finds too many targets, and then he just wins. Let's see how this plays out. Queen a5, rook c1, bishop f6, knight d4, knight takes c5, takes. So it's not strictly speaking an isolated pawn structure anymore. It's more like a hanging pawn. But even in this case, we could argue that these pawns are more of weaknesses than strengths or vices for the position. Knight e4, queen c2, takes, queen takes a2. Looks like it's losing a queen, but not really, because that bishop is hanging and Duda spots that, obviously. Rook c2, queen a3, rook a1. And we are almost at the endgame part. It's not quite yet an endgame, but it feels like a middle game that's closer to an endgame than like a regular middle game you're used to. This is very much unlike a dragon position. So bishop e6, over defending the d pawn, rook d2, queen b4. So there are different objectives for the sides. Wesley's objective is to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, because in that case this king can become vulnerable and that could be an extra added target. For black, for Jan-Krzysztof Duda, he's actually hoping to somehow exchange off the A pawn for the B pawn. If that happens, even if he loses the D pawn, that might just lead to a very well-known drawn endgame. Rook D3, Rook FC8, Queen A6, H6. Very reasonable choice, just creating a loft for the king. H3, Rook C3. Aiming for what I said, he's trying to somehow win the B pawn, because if he can do so, he's more than likely to be drawing. Queen A3. So you can see that Wesley is trying to get into the endgame without having that exchange happen. Takes, takes. Rook takes D3, takes. King F8, King F1. Rook B8, King E2, Rook B7. So I would say that both sides sort of achieved their objective. Black achieved the objective of actually having a close to even position. And white has achieved the objective of having an advantage, looking like a draw, but not quite a draw yet. And this is what I would call, maybe 50-50 is a bit optimistic. You could maybe argue that it's easier for white to play this position because a couple of slips can ruin Duda's chances, as we shall see. King D2, King E7. Now the second objective for Wesley will be to push this B pawn up, so there is no hope of ever exchanging the pawn, and also sort of pushing black back. King C3, bringing the king up, check, King D4. Centralizing, something that's very important in rook and pawn endings. Rook B7, King C5. Trying to come closer to the A pawn. Check. King here. Bishop A6. Now you might be wondering again, why did Wesley repeat there? That is the typical probing way of playing these positions. You're sort of wondering if your opponent will defend accurately. And you're sort of nudging them, hey, are you okay? Do you know what you're doing? And so far Duda is showing no signs of giving up. Rook C7, trying to get counterplay, but of course that's not going to happen. The rook is just going to take away that square. Bishop F5, and here comes this maneuver we talked about. He's getting and pushing that B pawn forward. Now also Bishop A6 was a nice touch by Wesley. He's taken away this active square from the rook, and this rook is somewhat without targets. It does defend the A7 pawn, but apart from defending, it doesn't really do much. Bishop E6, objective done. I could push the pawn to B4. Now I'll go back as B5 will be on the cards. Rook B7, B5. So plenty of objectives has been done so far by Wesley. He got the king activated. He got the pawn to B5. This is a potential target. D5 is a potential target. So essentially he has everything to win this position. Does that mean it's lost for Duda? Definitely not. Anytime white would get aggressive, that will give some counter chances for Duda. Bishop D7. Notice he is immediately going for these strategies. Now if you take on D5, there's Bishop B5. And this is what I've been talking about. Even if you somehow win the A pawn, this is considered very drawish. I mean, black might not even lose it yet, but even if he loses it, it is probably more likely to be a draw than not. But he goes Rook A5, of course. He's not going to exchange it off. He wants to keep the B pawn. Bishop E6, F4. So objective has been accomplished on the queen side. So he's looking for other and new weaknesses on the king side. F6, G4. rook c7, rook a6. Again, rook a6 isn't necessarily the best move, but it's probing, saying, are you going to tolerate the presence of my rook? And of course, Duda is saying, no, I'm not going to tolerate the presence of that rook. Rook a5, here, rook a6, here, rook a4. So he keeps repeating, but he sort of slowly improves his pieces. So you notice he's not putting it back to a5, but a4, and he claims that, okay, I made a slight adjustment here. So there's a new thread that you will have to look out for. Bishop e6, bishop e2. Not yet a threat, but it is a hint of a threat of bishop f3. King d6, you're going back. King e7, rook a4, king d6, f5. So 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And slowly he's actually going to roll forward. Now he's making another step forward. Bishop f7, rook a6, king e7, bishop d1. And these mysterious moves actually make a lot of sense because it kind of trips up Duda. Because not only does Wesley threaten bishop b3, but he also threatens ideas of bishop f3. And it's very difficult to keep up with this in a practical game. You might think or notice with a computer that, okay, this is holdable, but it's very unpleasant to face because the threats of Wesley is so ambiguous. Rook c4, here rook c7. But so far, Duda is very patient. He's not reacting too much, and he's just waiting for Wesley to show his hands. And he can do that because anytime Wesley goes for a clear-cut plan, that will expose a target, let's say on b5, or sometimes some weaknesses on the other side. King d4, check, here, bishop e2. And again, this is a bit of a psychological warfare. White is sort of hinting, oh, you're very close to a draw, you're very close to a repetition, but you're never really going to get it. King d7, king d4, king e7, h4. Again, slightly improving on the position, hinting at a potential g5 or h5, fixing this g7 pawn. And in that case, there'll be 1, 2, and 3 weaknesses if we add up the g pawn. King d7, Duda is not budging. Bishop d1, here, back. Bishop b3, now he makes this move. King e7, here, rook b7, rook a5. Of course, Wesley is not going to give up on the b pawn. Rook d7, here, rook b7. Oh, not rook c7, because that would leave this pawn hanging, but rook b7, again trying to take that. King c5. And this is the moment I feel that Duda got a little bit tired of reacting, because most of the things that he's been doing so far for like 20, 30 moves is just reacting to Wesley's threats. And he sort of gives up on that idea. He definitely should have checked here and just wondered, what are you going to do if I chase your king away? But he sort of got tired of that and played rook d7. Rook a5, check, king d4, here, bishop a2. But now it's a different scenario. And there is a difference between this position with the rook on a6 and the rook on a5. With the rook on a6, black had this idea of rook b7 and then going back. Now you can go rook b7 because of bishop takes d5, here then e4, and white is very close to be winning because black is just too passive and down a pawn. So here Wesley sort of outsmarted his young Polish opponent, who's a big talent, of course, in his own right. Now the rook on a5 is actually defending the pawn, and black is running out of moves. You can't move the rook, you lose the d-pawn. You can't move anything on d6 and d8, you lose the a7 pawn. So Zugzwang is very much the name of the game. King d8, king c5, rook c7, back, rook a6. But notice the king moved, so even if we have any sort of exchanges, the king might just bolt in there at some good moment. King e7, rook c6, rook b7, here, they're just repeating once more, h5. Again, sort of keeping Duda under wraps and constant pressure. So if you ask me, this sort of reminds me more of a boxing match than a chess match. And Duda just never gets enough time to get out of trouble. He's under pressure, constantly being asked questions, and there's no bell to save him. King d8, rook c5, and now the pawn falls, and that means only bad things for Duda. King e7, takes, king takes d5, and as we talked about earlier, there's just too much difference between the activity of pieces. White has an amazing king on d5, a great rook on c5, and the Polish player just has two passive pieces now. He sort of missed his boat of being a little bit more aggressive earlier on. King d7, king c4, moving around, going after the a-pawn. Rook b6, but he checks now. Just asking the question, are you going to go this way? Well then, I can go and play on this side of the board. If you move this way, I might just consider going the other direction. King c7, king c5, rook b8, e4. A very natural decision. Wesley is trying to get closer to the g-pawn. Rook b6, e5, takes, king d7, rook e6. And that's kind of the tragedy of Duda's position. You can't really go into the endgame because White's king is just infinitely better than Black's, and this b-pawn that Wesley kept and nurtured for so long is going to win the game. So he has to go rook b7, but then rook g6, and now it really curtains. Because check, king e8, f6, g takes, rook takes h6, and with this many weaknesses, two connected pawns, White is just completely dominating the position. Here, rook g6, again, emphasizing the fact that the endgame is completely won. Here, rook takes f6, here, king e4. And if the pawn was somewhere on h7 or g7 or f7, g7 of course would be a bit ridiculous, could take the rook, but let's say f7 or h7, there would be some drawing chances there. But with two connected pass pawns, this is an easy win for the elite, and Wesley of course is an elite player. King e7, rook f5, keeping that king out of sorts, and in that case, promoting the h and g pawn is just easier. Check. Here, rook b1, h6, rook h1, g5. Those pawns are just too fast. Rook a5. Attacking that pawn and defending that pawn from the sides. There, king g4, king f7, check, king g8, here, check. This would be checkmate. That is avoided by Duda. Rook a7, rook b1, and after king h5, he resigned, rightfully so, because there is no escaping this position. A very nice game by Wesley, slowly building the advantage and crashing through in the right moment. So I really hope you enjoyed these games by Dubov and Wesley. So, hope you enjoyed your time. Goodbye.